There are days that divide life in two. Days that mark a clear before and after. Such is the beginning of Anna Willems' story, as recounted by Dr. Joe Dispenza. A sudden, devastating event hurled her out of the world she once knew and thrust her, without choice, into an entirely new dimension of existence. It was a Sunday, early in the summer of 2007. Anna was resting at home. The doors to the living room were open to the garden, letting in the soft air. White curtains danced with the breeze, while birdsong mingled with the distant laughter of children playing. Her 12-year-old son was reading on the sofa. Her 11-year-old daughter sang joyfully from upstairs. Anna, a psychotherapist and senior director at a major mental health institution in Amsterdam, was using the quiet moment to read a professional article. Everything felt peaceful, but something wasn't right. Her husband had left early that morning without explanation. He'd hugged their children before leaving, but had not answered any of Anna's attempts to reach him throughout the day. A subtle sense of unease began to settle within her. That strange emptiness, so difficult to name, grew heavier as the hours passed. At 3:30 in the afternoon, the doorbell rang. 2 police officers were standing at the door. "Are you Mrs. Willems?" Upon confirming her identity, they asked to come in. Within seconds, her entire reality collapsed. They informed her that her husband had been found lifeless after a tragic incident earlier that same morning, from the top of a building in the city centre. Time itself seemed to freeze. Her breath caught in her chest. A wave of involuntary trembling overtook her. A sharp pressure surged through her head, an aching void in her stomach, and sudden tension in her neck and shoulders. Her mind, flooded by shock, spiraled into chaotic thoughts. Stress hormones had seized control. Anna entered emergency mode. While her children froze in silence, she tried to remain composed. But inside, she was shattering. The atmosphere around her, once calm and filled with simple domestic joy, suddenly became alien. The gentle flutter of the curtains now felt ominous. The chirping of birds, once comforting, turned into a backdrop of cruel contrast. Anna's sense of safety was shattered not just internally, but in the very fabric of her surroundings. The world she had built, of routines, laughter, and quiet stability, was no longer recognizable. Her body reacted first. A cold sweat, a tight jaw, a quickened heartbeat. Her mind followed with spiraling thoughts that made no sense but carried the weight of irreversible truth. The ordinary had collapsed into the unthinkable. There was no map for what she felt. Her nervous system, her body, her emotions, everything reacted as if under immediate threat. And in many ways it was. Joe Dispenza explains that such responses are not only natural, but deeply biological. The human body is built to adapt to danger. But when that danger is emotional, internal, and overwhelming, the impact can embed itself in every cell. That day, Anna stopped being just a mother, a professional, a wife. She became someone else entirely, no longer simply the woman who had lived a stable life. She now carried an emotional weight that would affect her health, her mind, and her very identity. And though she didn't know it then, what had just happened was not the end. It was the beginning of a transformation that would test every part of her being, and years later, open the door to the extraordinary. After that life-altering event, Anna Willems found herself trapped in an internal state with no visible exit. Her body, mind, and emotions had all aligned in one direction: survival. As Dr. Joe Dispenza explains, Living in a constant state of stress is, scientifically speaking, living in emergency mode, and the human body was never designed to sustain that state indefinitely. When a situation is perceived as threatening, the sympathetic nervous system is activated. The heart rate increases, breathing becomes rapid, pupils dilate, and blood is redirected from the internal organs to the limbs to prepare for fight or flight. This is highly effective when the threat is real and short-lived. But for Anna, the danger hadn't ended that day. She relived it repeatedly in her mind whenever she thought about what had happened. Her body couldn't tell the difference between memory and the actual event. Each time she remembered it, she experienced the same devastating emotions, and her body produced the same stress-related chemicals. As Dispenza puts it, emotions are the chemical consequences of past experiences. What Anna didn't yet understand was that by mentally reliving the trauma, she was reprogramming her biology to remain stuck in the past, and her body responded faithfully, as if it were all happening again. Day after day, her physiology became saturated with stress chemicals. The energy her body needed to heal was being drained by anxiety, fear, guilt, and sorrow. Each new day became a mirror of the one before. Anna's world shrank into a cycle of doctor visits, unanswered questions, and silent suffering. Friends began to distance themselves, unsure of how to help or what to say. Even those closest to her couldn't fully grasp the invisible war being waged within her. Her children, still so young, watched their once strong mother weaken, both physically and emotionally. Sleep offered no relief. She often awoke with racing thoughts and a pounding heart, her mind dragging her back to the moment everything changed. The trauma had carved itself so deeply into her memory that even neutral experiences became tainted by fear. Dispenza often points out that the more we think and feel from past experiences, the more we hardwire those emotional states into our biology. In Anna's case, those emotions were becoming the architects of her future. Without intervention, she was unknowingly rehearsing the same internal state, day after day. What was most alarming was that her mental state began to manifest physically. Unable to release her emotional tension, her immune system began to weaken. Her mind was trapped in constant loops. How would she raise her children alone? Why didn't she see the signs? Where had she gone wrong? These painful questions repeated endlessly. 9 months later, in March 2008, Anna woke up unable to move the lower half of her body. She was rushed to hospital and diagnosed with severe neuritis. Her immune system had started attacking her own nerves. She couldn't walk or control her bladder or bowels. This partial paralysis was only the beginning. Doctors found no structural explanation. They told her it was likely an autoimmune condition. From Joe Dispenza's perspective, this made perfect sense. Anna's body had become so stuck in past emotions that her biology started to reflect that stagnation. Her body couldn't move forward because her mind still lived in the moment of trauma. The prescribed treatment included strong steroids and antibiotics, which further compromised her immune system. Financially, her situation deteriorated rapidly. She couldn't work, relied on her mother's help, and barely managed to care for her children. The physical pain added to the emotional burden. Dispenza states, "The past becomes our biology." And that is exactly what happened to Anna. By remaining stuck in the story of her loss, her body began to narrate it too. She didn't just think about the past. She was emotionally and physically reliving it every single day. Her identity was no longer that of a stable professional. She had become a woman marked by tragedy, defined by suffering. At that point, all seemed lost. But the body holds a deep intelligence. And even in collapse, there is a spark capable of igniting transformation. The human body is a faithful reflection of the mind's inner state. Trapped in a cycle of stress, pain, and guilt, Anna Willems began to physically manifest everything she could not release emotionally. What Joe Dispenza describes as the darkest night of the soul is not merely a spiritual metaphor, but a real stage in which consciousness hits rock bottom to begin its transformation. After her diagnosis of neuritis and the partial paralysis that left her without control of her legs and basic functions, Anna's health continued to deteriorate. Unresolved emotions continued to poison her system. Instead of improving, her body developed new autoimmune disorders. One of them was a painful condition that affected the mucous membranes in her mouth and esophagus, known as erosive lichen planus. Every symptom was a physical reminder of the emotional collapse she had not yet processed. Doctors prescribed more treatments, ointments, steroids, medications, but no one asked how she was feeling emotionally. No one addressed the root of the issue. Her body was reacting to a mind trapped in suffering. By 2010, she found herself in a dysfunctional relationship with a man who verbally abused her and her children. She had lost her home, her stability, her health, and with them, her sense of safety. She lived in a constant state of alertness, facing new allergies, skin conditions, digestive issues, and a fatigue so overwhelming it forced her to spend afternoons in bed. She barely managed to see a few patients from home in the mornings. Her immune system had completely collapsed. She was isolated. She no longer left the house, had no social life, and lacked the energy to try. Her thinking was chaotic, her concentration minimal. She existed in a constant state of automatic reaction. The slightest demand would spike her heart rate above 200 beats per minute, accompanied by sweating, breathlessness, and constant chest pressure. Anna's body was screaming everything her soul had been silencing. She was living her darkest night of the soul. In those years, Anna felt like a ghost in her own life. Her reflection in the mirror no longer looked familiar. The vibrant woman she once was had faded into someone barely surviving. She no longer recognized her voice when she spoke, or the thoughts that echoed in her mind. Simple tasks became monumental. Eating, showering, or getting out of bed required all her energy. She had lost connection not only with others, but with herself. Her body was present, but her spirit felt distant, trapped in a story that seemed endless. Dispenza points out that when a person identifies too closely with their suffering, that suffering becomes their identity. In Anna's case, trauma had shaped every cell, every thought, every choice. And without awareness, she was unknowingly living the same emotional script, one written in the language of pain. Then came what many would consider the final blow. In January 2011, doctors discovered a mass near the entrance to her stomach. The diagnosis was esophageal cancer. Rather than exploring the psychological and emotional suffering that had accumulated over the years, she was offered an aggressive chemotherapy protocol. Her stress response was fully activated and couldn't be shut off. Every cell in her body seemed to vibrate with despair. Dispenza notes that when the body becomes accustomed to stress hormones, they can become a form of emotional addiction. Unknowingly, people recreate external conditions that allow them to maintain the same internal state. Anna had become so accustomed to suffering that even her biology seemed to depend on it. She agreed to start treatment, but after the first round of chemotherapy, her world shattered. One day, after her children left for school, She collapsed onto the floor and burst into tears. She felt empty, broken, directionless. At that moment, she hit rock bottom. From that abyss, she did something that would change the course of her story. She prayed, not from fear, but from complete surrender. She asked for guidance, help, a way out. She promised that if she found a way to heal, she would dedicate her life to gratitude and to sharing that knowledge with others. And with that intention, she ignited the spark that would lead her back to life. After reaching emotional and physical rock bottom, Anna Willems was no longer the same. Something within her had given way. It wasn't defeat. It was an act of deep surrender. That opening allowed a new possibility to emerge, a way out through consciousness. Within days, she began to explore on her own. She wasn't searching for medical treatments, but for understanding. She wanted to know what was happening to her beyond clinical language. That's how she came across the work of Dr. Joe Dispenza, and something instantly resonated. The concepts were clear and powerful. Dispenza explained how the human body, conditioned by years of emotions, could become trapped in a chemically driven state rooted in the past. And most revealing of all, he affirmed that the body doesn't distinguish between a real experience and one that is vividly imagined. My body doesn't know the difference between what's real and what it imagines. For Anna, this was a revelation. She realized her body had been reliving the same trauma repeatedly, not because the events had returned, but because her thoughts had never changed. Every memory, every painful emotion had been reinforcing a biological circuit of illness. That idea became the starting point. If her mind had trained her body to become ill, then it could also train it to heal. I can retrain my mind and change my body. She began with what she had: silence, breath, and a firm intention. Each day she dedicated a few minutes to observing her thoughts and imagining herself healthy. It was difficult at first. Her body resisted. Old emotions surfaced, but she persisted. She knew she wasn't trying to escape. She was rebuilding. Inspired by Dispenza's books and lectures, she created a small ritual. Meditating in the morning, visualizing a future version of herself full of vitality, and writing down any negative thoughts she noticed throughout the day. The goal was to identify her automatic programming, the patterns that kept her connected to pain. Gradually, she began to notice a change, not in her physical symptoms yet, but in her perception. She had direction. She also began to reflect on the emotional patterns she had normalized, how chronic stress had become a familiar companion, and how her identity had been shaped by years of fear and loss. There was no quick fix, but she sensed something powerful in the consistency of the practice. She wasn't aiming to erase the past, but to stop rehearsing it. Each meditation, each breath of intention, was a quiet rebellion against her old self, a way to remind her body that it could begin again, that change was not only possible, but already unfolding. Joe Dispenza teaches that by changing our internal state, we can create new emotions, which in turn generate new chemical signals that activate different genes. For Anna, this was the science of hope. It was no longer blind faith, but daily practice rooted in understanding. The key wasn't to wish for a different body, but to become a different mind. A mind capable of sustaining elevated emotions, visualizing wellness as if it already existed, and sending the body a new message. This future is already happening. That was the true beginning, the decision to stop being the person who got sick and become someone capable of healing. Anna Willems was no longer fighting illness. She was cultivating a new way of being. Each day, she immersed herself in a practice that went far beyond the physical. She was retraining her mind, and in doing so, reshaping her biology. This transformation, as Dr. Joe Dispenza explains, is not magical but scientifically observable. Thought directs intention, and sustained emotion turns it into reality. The thought sends a signal, and the feeling draws it back. Every morning, Anna sat to meditate. She closed her eyes and left behind her identity of illness. She was no longer the sick woman, the exhausted mother, the victim of her past. In her mind, she became a version of herself already healthy, vibrant, joyful. And though it was difficult at first to hold that image, little by little, her body began to respond. Dispenza teaches that the brain is a record of the past, and each repeated thought reinforces old neural circuits. But when we choose a new thought and pair it with an elevated emotion like gratitude, love, or hope, we activate neuroplasticity. New connections open, and the body receives a different message. Anna began to feel a subtle expansion in her chest. At times, she experienced calm, serenity, even joy. Her breathing grew deep and rhythmic. Though her symptoms didn't vanish overnight, her relationship with them changed. She no longer feared them. She understood they were remnants of an old program being overwritten. For weeks, she repeated this practice with devotion. She visualized her immune system strong, her body working in harmony. She imagined hugging her children with energy, walking along the beach, laughing freely, her body, unable to distinguish between the real and the vividly imagined, began to reflect signs of recovery. When mind and body are aligned, the person is in a new state of being. She began journaling her emotional states each evening, noting what triggered her stress and what elevated her spirit. This small act of self-inquiry gave her insight into the unconscious thoughts that once ruled her day. She noticed patterns, moments when old fear crept in, or when subtle doubts dimmed her vision of wellness. But with awareness came power. Each insight became an opportunity to rewire her response. She reminded herself that healing was not a destination, but a process of becoming. In choosing again and again to embody her future self, she was training her body to follow a new blueprint. It was no longer just about healing an organ or suppressing a symptom. Anna was cultivating an entirely new identity. Dispenza summarizes it this way: you must become the person you want to be before the change can happen. And Anna was doing just that. Without realizing it, she had stopped reacting like the wounded woman. Now she thought, felt, and acted like someone undergoing transformation. This internal shift did not rely on external circumstances. It required no perfect conditions. It was the fruit of a sustained decision to think differently, to feel with intention, to act as if it were already real. And with each session, her body affirmed it. She was beginning to become supernatural. Months passed since Anna Willems began reprogramming her mind through daily meditations, guided visualization, and a renewed emotional focus. What started as a desperate attempt to survive soon became a profound journey of inner expansion. And then, her body began sending clear signals that something real was unfolding. The body is a reflection of the mind. That statement by Dr. Joe Dispenza began to resonate with her deeply. Gradually, the physical symptoms that had burdened her for years started to disappear. The incontinence, chronic fatigue, pain, and partial paralysis were no longer part of her daily experience. She no longer needed a cane, and her energy returned naturally. Doctors were baffled. Her medical history showed severe autoimmune diseases, a diagnosis of esophageal cancer, and significant damage to her nervous system. But now, clinical tests told a different story. No signs of inflammation, no organ dysfunction. The cancer was gone. The evidence was in the biology. This wasn't an unexplained remission. For Anna, it was the direct result of transforming her internal state. Dispenza explains that when a person shifts their thinking, emotions, and energetic signature, they begin activating new neural networks, modifying genetic expression, and sending coherent signals to the body. That coherence brings order where once there was chaos. Anna hadn't resorted to aggressive alternative therapies or secret protocols. Her transformation was entirely internal. She chose elevated emotions, stopped reliving the past, and focused on living in a higher frequency. This sustained shift led to a complete reorganization of her physiology. Where once her body reacted to fear, it now responded to gratitude. Miracles are common events when personality is transcended. Over time, she stopped taking medication. Her diet improved naturally, not as a restriction, but as an act of nourishment. She was no longer avoiding pain, but nurturing vitality. Her relationships changed as well. She distanced herself from toxic environments, reclaimed her role as a present mother, and began guiding others through similar transformational journeys. Anna also started to notice changes that went beyond the medical realm. She felt more connected to life, more present in the moment, more attuned to her intuition, and increasingly guided by a quiet inner wisdom. Each morning brought a sense of renewal, and each evening carried a calm reflection that no longer stemmed from survival, but from alignment. She began to appreciate small moments, a warm breeze, a deep breath, the laughter of her children, as signs that her inner world was stabilizing. These were not extraordinary events, but they felt sacred nonetheless. What amazed her most was how this shift affected others. Her presence inspired hope. Friends, patients, and even strangers would ask her what she had done to recover. She would simply smile and say, "I changed from the inside out." And that truth, she knew, was everything. Anna became living proof of the power of consciousness. She no longer needed to convince anyone. Her story spoke for itself. In conferences, interviews, and testimonials, she humbly shared what she had learned, that healing is possible when the soul takes the lead, when the body becomes a messenger of inner balance, and when the mind stops being a battlefield to become a bridge to the divine. This chapter is not the end of her journey. It marks the beginning of a new life, one based on coherence, purpose, and expansion. Because when the body heals, so does the soul. And when the soul awakens, the body reflects it. The story of Anna Willems is not merely one of healing. It is one of complete transformation. She was no longer a woman who had overcome illness. She had transcended her former identity. Gone was the exhausted mother, the hopeless patient, the professional burdened by pain. She now lived from a new state of awareness, and her body was simply the outward evidence of that inner metamorphosis. She didn't just change her body, she changed her consciousness. That's how Dr. Joe Dispenza summarizes the journey of those like Anna, who have reconfigured their lives from within. She no longer reacted from the past. Her energy was coherent. Her focus aligned with an elevated vision of herself. And that vision was sustained by clear thoughts, elevated emotions, and conscious decisions. After confirming her full recovery, Anna knew she could not return to her old life, not because she refused, but because she simply was no longer that person. She wasn't the same anymore, and that's why her body wasn't either. Her new mission emerged naturally, to share what she had learned. She began writing short articles, then gave talks and led workshops, at first in small groups, then on larger platforms. People from all walks of life came to hear her, not as a miraculous exception, but as a possible map for human transformation. Anna didn't speak from theory. She spoke from lived experience, from the body that had manifested a new frequency, from the mind that had learned to shape reality, from the soul that had awakened. There's no greater power than someone who has healed and now teaches others to do the same. Joe Dispenza makes this point clear. When a person stops being a victim and becomes a creator, they not only change how their body responds, but also influence the world around them. People like Anna become catalysts of consciousness. They radiate coherence, inspire by presence, and remind others that change is possible. Today, Anna lives in complete health. She wakes each morning in gratitude, not because she escaped death, but because she discovered the value of life. Her routine still includes meditation, visualization, and moments of deep connection. Not because she is ill, but because she chooses to live consciously. She often reflected on how far she had come, not just in her health, but in her entire way of being. The journey taught her that healing isn't simply the absence of illness, but the presence of alignment between body, mind, and soul. There were still challenges, of course, but they no longer ruled her state of being. Instead of fear, she met uncertainty with curiosity. Instead of fatigue, she cultivated presence. Each choice reaffirmed her commitment to consciousness. Anna understood now that transformation was not about fixing the broken, but about revealing the wholeness that had always been there waiting. She no longer waits for the outside world to change so she can feel well. She generates wellness from within. Her past no longer defines her. Her present honors her, and her future is crafted daily, thought by thought, emotion by emotion. Her life is living testimony to a profound truth. When the mind aligns with the heart and the soul takes the lead, there is no limit to what the body can express. And that concludes our video. If you enjoyed the content as much as we did, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss a single episode. Leave a comment below. We'd love to hear your feedback and suggestions for future videos. And don't forget to turn on notifications to stay up to date with all our updates. Thanks for being part of our community. See you in the next video.